The morning was quiet and clear when Marcus Bryant pulled his car into a shaded spot a few blocks from the address listed in the email. He liked arriving early and unnoticed, a habit he'd developed after years of working in corporate negotiations, where observation was often more valuable than introduction. Today, he wasn't showing up as a public figure or CEO. He wasn't interested in making an impression. He was here as a buyer, serious, pre-approved, and prepared to close. The house was one he'd been eyeing for weeks, a recently listed 5-bedroom with clean architecture, modern updates, and a wide, tree-lined front yard. It wasn't flashy, but it was intentional. Quiet elegance was what he preferred. He stepped out of the car wearing a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and low-profile sneakers. It was the weekend, and he hadn't come to impress anyone. In his hand was a slim leather folder holding financial paperwork, bank credentials, and a pre-approval letter from his private banker. He didn't need an agent to guide him. He'd reviewed the disclosures himself, read the comps in the neighborhood, and had already spoken to the listing office the day before. The open house, they had told him, was between 10 and 2. No appointment necessary. Just come by. As he walked toward the house, he took in the details. The lawn was freshly cut, hedges trimmed. A small black sandwich board stood near the sidewalk that read, "Open House, please come in." A silver SUV was parked in the driveway, probably belonging to the agent or a curious neighbor who wanted a closer look. Marcus stepped lightly onto the path, glancing at the landscaping, noting the new concrete pour and the condition of the gutters. He didn't walk slowly, but he didn't rush either. This wasn't a fantasy visit for him. It was business. He reached the top step just as the front door opened. A woman stepped out, blonde, in her early 40s, wearing a tailored blazer over a cream blouse. She held a tablet in one hand and a paper brochure in the other. Her eyes locked on him immediately. She didn't smile. She didn't say hello. She narrowed her gaze slightly, scanning him from head to toe, pausing briefly at the folder in his hand, then settling on his face. Marcus offered a polite nod. "Morning. I'm here for the open house." She didn't move from the doorway. Instead, her brows lifted as if she'd misheard him, then settled into a more guarded expression. "The open house is for serious buyers," she said. Her tone was even but tight. The kind of voice people used when delivering a message they wanted to sound neutral, but couldn't keep their discomfort out of. "I am a buyer," Marcus said, still calm, his voice steady. She didn't acknowledge the statement. Instead, she glanced past him down the street, then back again. "Do you have an agent with you?" "No. I'm here on my own," he replied. There was a pause. She tapped her tablet, looked at him again, and said, "I think you're looking for a different showing. This house is listed well above $1 million. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd heard the tone before. She wasn't asking questions. She was delivering a conclusion she'd already arrived at. Still, he remained still, saying nothing more. He knew there were moments when silence exposed more than argument ever could. She stared at him a moment longer, then said, "You'll need to leave the property. This isn't for you." She turned sharply and walked back into the house, letting the door close behind her with a finality that needed no explanation. Marcus stood for a moment, motionless. He looked at the door, then down at the sign by the sidewalk that still read, "Open House," in bold black letters. No conditions, no disclaimers. Then he slowly turned, walked back down the path, and headed toward the street. He didn't call out. He didn't knock again. He simply walked, his grip tightening around the folder in his hand. What she didn't know, what she hadn't cared to ask, was that the name on the wire transfer she'd soon be waiting for was his. Marcus walked slowly down the driveway, not because he was uncertain, but because he was giving himself a moment to collect, his breath not from exhaustion but from restraint. He had long ago trained himself not to react impulsively to moments like this. It was something that came with being a black man in spaces where you weren't expected, or worse, where your presence was viewed as a disruption. Every step he took away from that house was measured not in defeat, but in deliberate calm. He had come prepared to evaluate a home, but now he was taking mental notes on something entirely different, something that couldn't be found in a real estate brochure. Behind him, the house stood still and silent. He didn't turn around to look at it again. He didn't need to. The interaction had told him everything he needed to know about how the listing agent viewed him. She hadn't asked for his name. She hadn't asked why he was there. She had seen his clothes, seen his skin, and made a decision. She'd delivered it like a routine rejection, not with cruelty, but with that brand of practiced professionalism that masks discrimination behind etiquette. As he neared the end of the path, another car pulled up to the curb. It was a sleek black sedan, spotless and clearly detailed, the kind that spoke to preparation and efficiency. The driver stepped out briskly. Leah, his legal representative and occasional buyer's agent when he needed someone on the record. She had a slim briefcase in hand and sunglasses perched on her head. Her heels clicked softly as she walked across the sidewalk. When she saw Marcus standing outside the gate instead of inside the house, she slowed, brows furrowing as her eyes moved between him and the front door. "You didn't go in?" she asked, puzzled. Marcus didn't answer right away. He tilted his head toward the house. "Didn't get the chance." Leah glanced toward the door, then back to him, her voice lowering slightly. "Did she say something?" "She told me this wasn't for me." For a second, Leah's jaw tightened, her hand tightening slightly on the briefcase handle. "You're joking." "No," Marcus said. "I wish I were." Without another word, Leah turned and headed up the path, her pace faster now, her movements sharper. Marcus didn't follow. He stood near the sidewalk, letting her handle it. This wasn't the first time Leah had walked into a situation already half broken. She was good at letting facts speak louder than feelings. At the door, Leah knocked once, then pushed it open when it didn't latch completely. Inside, voices could be heard. A couple chatting near the kitchen, the soft murmur of another agent on the phone in a side room. The listing agent, Diane, reappeared in the hallway looking up as Leah entered. Her smile flickered in place automatically. "Hi there," Diane said. "Are you here for the open house?" Leah returned the smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, I'm Marcus Bryant's representative." There was a pause. Diane blinked, as though the name took a moment to register. Then she glanced back toward the open doorway, where Marcus was still visible at the edge of the walkway. Her face paled just slightly. "He's the buyer," Leah continued, her voice crisp. "I assume you have the documents ready?" Diane didn't respond immediately. Her expression faltered. Her posture changed. The smile didn't return. She stepped back slightly, almost as if she were physically trying to make space for what she hadn't seen coming. Around them, the other visitors began to notice something shift. The atmosphere turned quiet, heavy with the awkward tension of people realizing they might have just witnessed something they weren't sure how to name. Leah didn't give Diane a chance to explain. She walked past her, opened her briefcase, and began laying out papers on the dining table. "We're ready to proceed with the inspection," she said over her shoulder. "He'll be back inside in just a moment. I expect we'll be treated accordingly this time." Marcus stood by the curb, arms loosely folded, watching the scene unfold from a distance. He could see Leah's silhouette moving with purpose through the entryway, and although he couldn't hear her words, he knew her tone. It was the same controlled, professional cadence she used in depositions and contract disputes, firm but never loud, clear enough to remind people they were no longer in control of the narrative. The silence that had followed Diane's attempt to dismiss him now stretched uncomfortably through the open doorway, broken only by occasional nervous glances from the guests still lingering in the front rooms. Some of them had watched the earlier exchange between Diane and Marcus. They hadn't intervened. But now, with the pieces clicking into place, they began to see that what they had witnessed wasn't just awkward, it was wrong. Inside, Diane hovered near the foyer. her tablet now held tightly against her chest like a shield. Her professional facade had cracked, not in an obvious way, but in the slight tremor of her voice and the way her gaze refused to settle. She wasn't sure how to recover from what had just happened, but she sensed it was too late. She tried to move as if nothing were wrong, offering a brief smile to a couple standing by the fireplace. But even they gave her a strange, sidelong glance before murmuring something between them and slipping out the front door. Leah walked back toward the entrance, gave a small wave to Marcus, and called out, "Let's walk through, the property's ready." Marcus didn't respond right away. He took a long breath, then began walking slowly back up the driveway, not as a man returning to a place he had been invited into, but as someone reclaiming the right to stand where he always belonged. He moved past the open sign again, the same one that had meant nothing just an hour ago, and stepped up onto the porch without hesitation. He walked through the doorway, his expression unreadable, and entered the house with calm precision. As he crossed the threshold, Diane instinctively stepped aside, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to form words that might make this moment easier. But no words came. She watched Marcus walk past her without so much as a glance. She wanted to say something, an apology maybe, or a nervous explanation, but she knew it would only draw more attention to what she had already made plain. Everyone in the room now knew what she had assumed about the man in the hoodie, and they knew how wrong she had been. Marcus moved through the house slowly, taking in the layout, the finishes, the light through the windows. He asked Leah a few questions, all technical about the plumbing and roof certifications, and made a few notes in the margin of the packet she had prepared. At no point did he reference what had happened at the door. He didn't speak to Diane. He didn't need to. His presence in the room was enough. Every step he took was a quiet statement. Each corner of the house he inspected a reminder that dignity didn't require permission. In the kitchen, a young couple watching from the hallway whispered something to each other before approaching Marcus cautiously. "Hey," the man said, offering an awkward but sincere tone. "We, saw what happened earlier. Just wanted to say we're sorry. That shouldn't have happened." Marcus nodded once. "I appreciate that." They left soon after, but their words stayed with him, not because they changed anything, but because they acknowledged it. The house was still the same. The walls hadn't shifted. The floors still gleamed. But the energy had changed. The assumption that had been used to exclude him had now turned into a silence that filled the room with its own kind of reckoning. He didn't stay long. He didn't need to. He had come to assess the value of a house, but in the end, he had revealed the worth of something far more difficult to measure. And the one person who had tried to push him out now stood in the very place she had tried to guard, realizing just how small her authority had been. The sound of high heels striking the polished tile broke the uncomfortable quiet as Leah crossed the living room, her briefcase now open on the dining table where she had begun organizing documents for the walkthrough. The layout was simple and open, a modern design with neutral walls and elegant fixtures. Marcus followed her into the kitchen, pausing to examine the quality of the cabinetry, opening drawers, checking for alignment, observing the care taken or not taken in the finishing work. His expression remained composed, but behind his silence was a sharp, focused presence. He wasn't performing interest for show. He was calculating the reality of the investment, testing the seller's claims against what he could see with his own eyes. Diane stood a few feet behind, unsure whether to engage or vanish. Her eyes tracked Marcus carefully, but she didn't move toward him. She clutched her tablet like it might protect her from the shame now clinging to the walls. What had once been her space to control, her open house, had shifted in tone entirely. She had been hosting until moments ago. Now she was waiting for permission to speak. Leah glanced over her shoulder briefly and gestured toward Diane without looking directly at her. "You can go ahead and bring out the paperwork now. We'll need access to the inspection file and the disclosure sheets." Her tone was cool, detached, and entirely professional, just formal enough to remind Diane that this was now a legal transaction, not a social moment. Diane opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She turned silently and walked into the adjoining room, returning a moment later with the requested files. Leah took them without acknowledgement. She laid the packet flat, scanning the pages with precision, highlighting several lines before passing them to Marcus, who read without comment. Every movement was a reminder that this wasn't a favor being granted. It was a deal being executed, and he was the principal. A man in a blue blazer entered the house quietly from the front door, holding a branded clipboard and looking confused at the tension in the room. He was another agent from the same firm, there to shadow the open house and support the listing. His eyes moved from Marcus to Leah, then to Diane, who gave him a small shake of her head as if to say, "Don't ask." He stayed near the entryway, instinctively keeping his distance. As Marcus completed his circuit of the home, he finally paused in the large, glass-walled sunroom at the back of the house. The light there was clean and natural, the floor a dark hardwood that reflected the afternoon sun. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the modest yard. Leah stood beside him a moment later. She didn't speak right away. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was weighing not just numbers, but meaning. "I assume we're still interested," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Yes. I'll put in an offer at list. No contingencies. Full cash." Leah didn't blink. "I'll send it in today. They'll have to take it off the market once we sign." He turned toward her, his voice calm. "And let the brokerage know the file's going through you. I don't want her touching anything else." Leah glanced once more at Diane, who had now moved to a corner of the room, arms crossed, eyes downcast. "Understood." They moved back toward the dining table, where Leah collected the last of the documents and closed her case. Marcus extended a hand briefly, and she handed him the last sheet to sign. He did so without hesitation, sealing the offer that would bring the process to a close. Diane, still silent, didn't speak. She had said too much already, and now her silence carried all the weight her words had failed to. Marcus walked to the front door, opened it himself, and stepped outside into the sunlight. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The door closed gently behind him, and the moment it did, the line between assumption and truth was no longer a matter of opinion. It was a contract. And it was his name on the page. Marcus stepped off the porch and into the warmth of the early afternoon, his gait steady, his face unreadable. He didn't rush to his car. He took his time walking back down the long path, as if allowing each step to settle the moment further into the ground. There was no satisfaction on his face, no smugness, no trace of the vindication others might have worn. He didn't need any of it. He had walked into a space where he was told he didn't belong and left it with the future title of owner. That was enough. Inside the house, the mood had turned brittle. Diane remained standing near the window, watching Marcus walk away, her arms crossed tightly over her stomach. Her colleague, the man in the blue blazer, had pieced enough together from Leah's cold professionalism and Diane's silence to understand the basics, and now he stood awkwardly in the living room, unsure whether to offer help or retreat. Leah packed up her documents with brisk efficiency. She said nothing to Diane and didn't look at her again. Her expression was smooth, but there was no kindness in it now, only sharp purpose. She moved like someone who had handled this scenario before and no longer had patience for the script. A few moments later, Leah stepped outside and caught up with Marcus at the end of the walkway. She handed him a copy of the signed offer and gave a small nod. "I'll take it from here," she said. "You'll get a confirmation email from escrow this evening." Marcus took the folder, nodded once, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked, "Did she even try to apologize?" Leah exhaled lightly, the closest thing to a laugh that passed between them that day. "No, not in words, but I think she understood what just happened. I doubt she'll forget it." He glanced down the street, eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood. the trimmed hedges, the symmetry of wealth and order that lined both sides. "She was guarding the wrong door," he said quietly. "That's usually how it goes," Leah replied. "People confuse their position with authority." They stood in silence for a few seconds more before Marcus turned to his car. "Let me know when we hear back. I want everything in writing by tonight." "You'll have it," Leah said. "And if anything shifts, I'll deal with it directly." He got into the car and closed the door with a soft, final motion. The engine started, the vehicle eased into the road, and within moments he had disappeared down the tree-lined street, leaving behind a house that now held a new kind of memory. Not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed the reversal. Back inside, Diane finally sat down at the edge of the couch. Her tablet rested uselessly on the table. She didn't speak to her colleague. She didn't check her messages. She simply stared at the spot where Marcus had stood. It wasn't the first time she had dismissed someone based on appearance, but it was the first time the consequences had arrived so immediately, so undeniably. And it would be the last time she forgot that professionalism wasn't about protecting a price point. It was about honoring the people who could meet it without needing to prove they deserved to be there. The following day, the office where Diane worked was unusually quiet. Her colleagues moved through the hallways with a sense of caution, aware that something had happened but unsure how to ask. News of the open house had begun to ripple through the local real estate network. It wasn't in headlines or viral posts, but in group chats between agents, whispered conversations over coffee, and tight-lipped meetings among brokers who were already strategizing how to contain the damage. By mid-morning, the managing director of Diane's agency had requested a meeting with her in a glass-walled conference room, away from the buzz of the reception area. He didn't start with a question. He placed a printed summary of the incident on the table between them and asked her to explain what had happened. Diane sat across from him, her hands folded, her expression composed but lacking its usual confidence. She described the situation in vague terms, minimizing the confrontation, choosing her words carefully, speaking more about confusion than conduct. But the director interrupted her halfway through and slid a folder across the table. Inside were statements from the buyer's representative and the agency that had taken over the offer. The summary made it clear that Marcus had come fully qualified, prepared, and professionally. There was no ambiguity in the report. The facts were plain, and they were not in her favor. The director leaned back in his chair, his tone clipped and neutral. "You turned away a qualified buyer at the door based on nothing but assumption. That's not a misunderstanding. That's negligence with consequence." Diane said nothing. There wasn't much to argue. She had made a decision in a matter of seconds, and now the industry she had worked in for over a decade was staring back at her with scrutiny she hadn't prepared for. Outside that room, Marcus's offer was moving forward without issue. The sellers had accepted it within hours of receiving the documents. Leah had already confirmed that the funds were being wired into escrow, and the inspection had been scheduled for later that week. The transaction was efficient and uneventful, exactly how Marcus wanted it. He had no interest in dragging the incident into the public eye. His goal was never to shame or expose. It was to buy the house. Everything else had been noise created by someone else. Despite his silence, however, the agency where Diane worked released a brief internal memo to its staff later that week. It acknowledged the situation without naming names and outlined a new round of bias and conduct training that would be mandatory for all agents before the end of the quarter. The memo framed the initiative as part of a broader commitment to ethical standards and client equity, but everyone in the office knew exactly why it had been sent. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his life without altering his rhythm. He returned to work, made time for his meetings, and responded to a few quiet inquiries from close friends who had heard bits of the story. He shared no details. He simply confirmed the purchase and redirected the conversation. The moment hadn't been about him proving anything. It had been about revealing what already existed, what people chose to see when someone walked in without signaling wealth or status. And that lesson, he knew, would echo longer than any apology ever could. In real estate circles, Diane's name started to carry weight in a different way. Not scandal, but caution. Not infamy, but instruction. Her silence at the end of that open house had become part of the story. And now, even if no one ever brought it up in public, the memory would linger in every hallway she walked through. Not because she was the first to make the mistake, but because this time it had cost her more than she expected. As the escrow process moved forward, Marcus kept a low profile. He didn't speak to reporters, didn't post anything online, and didn't answer messages from acquaintances asking for details about the encounter at the open house. It wasn't because he wanted to avoid the topic. It was because he had already said everything he needed to without raising his voice. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was control. He had taken an experience rooted in disrespect and quietly redirected it into ownership of the property, of the moment, and of the larger conversation that had begun to take place beyond him. Leah, however, received several calls from real estate professionals in the days that followed, some expressing shock, others offering uncomfortable apologies, many asking if there would be legal action or if Marcus intended to go public. She answered each one briefly, professionally, and with the same calm tone she had used inside the house that day. She made it clear there were no plans for lawsuits or statements. The offer had been made. The deal was moving forward. Her client wanted results, not attention. But she didn't let any of them off the hook. In every conversation, she reminded them that what happened wasn't rare. It was just rarely exposed. And that alone was the problem. The real estate firm that employed Diane responded to the growing tension internally by expanding its training program with unusual speed. A local diversity consultant was brought in to advise on behavior-based bias in sales. They drafted a revised code of conduct for agents, focusing on first impressions, equitable client service, and immediate escalation procedures when complaints emerged. The office culture shifted not from scandal, but from pressure, subtle, uncomfortable, and constant. No one wanted to be the next agent caught assuming something they couldn't take back. Meanwhile, within Marcus's professional circle, word of the incident circulated quietly. A few executives congratulated him on the new purchase with unspoken understanding in their eyes. Others asked pointed questions about how often things like this still happened, as if shocked to hear it from someone they respected. Marcus never framed himself as a victim. He simply told the truth when asked. This wasn't about a house. It was about the assumptions people carry into rooms before a single word is exchanged. By the end of the week, a short opinion piece appeared in a regional real estate newsletter. It didn't mention Marcus or Diane by name, but the story was clear enough for those in the know. It asked what professionalism really meant when it fell apart under the weight of bias. It challenged readers to look past formal titles and policy language and instead examine the way judgment seeped into tone, body language, and the way people welcomed or failed to welcome others at the threshold. The article ended with a simple line that stuck with everyone who read it. "What would you have seen if he were standing at your door?" Marcus read the piece but didn't comment. He closed the tab, returned to his schedule, and kept moving. He didn't need credit for the shift that was now rippling through the industry. Change didn't always come with loud declarations. Sometimes it came in the form of quiet correction, sealed by a signature on a closing document, carried forward by the next agent who thought twice before judging someone by their shoes. The sun had just started to break through the morning haze when a large moving truck pulled up in front of the house. Its back doors swung open, revealing neatly packed boxes, carefully labeled with permanent marker. Movers in uniforms began unloading furniture with practiced ease, walking up the same driveway that only weeks ago had been the stage for a quiet dismissal. Neighbors peeked through blinds and open windows, curious to see who was moving in. The house had sold quickly, and rumors had circulated about a buyer from out of town, someone with deep pockets but no visible presence during the showings. Most hadn't seen him until now. Marcus stepped out of a sleek SUV and onto the sidewalk, dressed in a tailored button-down and dark slacks, not overly formal but unmistakably composed. He didn't arrive with a crowd or with fanfare. He walked slowly up the path, hands in his pockets, stopping briefly at the edge of the porch. He looked at the house the same way he had during the walkthrough, but now the expression in his eyes carried something different. There was no hesitation, no calculation. This time, there was comfort. This time, the space was his. He greeted the movers with a quick nod and gave a few instructions about which boxes belonged in the office and which went upstairs. Inside, the house echoed faintly with the sound of footsteps and furniture being set in place. The windows were open, letting in the morning air, and the hardwood floors reflected the light that spilled across them in long, warm patterns. It felt lived in already, not because of the furniture, but because Marcus carried presence like ownership, quiet, steady, unquestioned. At one point, he stepped out onto the front porch with a bottle of water in hand, watching as a neighbor crossed the street. She was older, polite, with a curious expression. She smiled and said hello, her voice light, casual. Marcus returned the greeting. She asked if he was the new owner, and he confirmed it with a single nod. There was a moment of pause, as if she wanted to ask more but chose not to. Instead, she welcomed him to the neighborhood and offered to introduce him to a few of the other residents over coffee sometime. He thanked her, then turned his gaze back to the street as she walked away. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same entrance he had been told wasn't for him was now a doorway he passed through freely. No one could block it, no one could question it, and no one needed to be told what had changed. The door hadn't grown any wider, but the assumptions at its threshold had been permanently altered. Later in the afternoon, Leah stopped by with a thin envelope in her hand. Inside were the final escrow documents and the deed, complete with the city's stamp. She placed it on the marble counter and tapped it once before saying, "It's officially yours. No disputes, no delays." Marcus picked it up, turned it over in his hands, then set it down beside his keys. There was nothing ceremonial about the moment, but it was full of meaning. They stood in the kitchen, looking out through the large rear window, the sun now arcing high and bright. Marcus didn't mention the agent. He didn't mention the rejection. He didn't have to. The house itself answered every question that had been raised. He walked Leah to the door, thanked her, and watched her drive away before returning inside, closing the door gently behind him. No statements had been made. No headlines had been written. But something lasting had taken root. It wasn't just ownership of property. It was ownership of space, of identity, of narrative. The man who had once been told to leave had returned not to argue, not to teach, but to live. And as the movers continued working, as the neighborhood settled back into its routine, the message was written into the very structure of the day, unspoken, undeniable, permanent.